Happy Wednesday, world. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Heads up, everyone. The FAA has just announced the very first commercial drone license for unmanned flights over American soil. So what lucky corporation was granted such an unprecedented license? Well, none other than my favorite oil giant and earth polluter, BP. Yes, BP's unmanned flights will be taking place over Alaska's Prudhoe Bay, some of the most pristine wilderness on the planet. You know, just the type of place that BP loves to cover and leak petroleum. Hell, BP had its third oil spill in the Alaskan tundra just last month. And now it's flying drones over the area to monitor the pipeline. See, Congress and the FAA didn't even plan to issue commercial drone licenses to private entities until September of 2015 in order to ensure safety rules of the industry. But I guess that just wasn't soon enough for BP. And now Congress will be forced to rush regulations to prevent mid-air collisions with regular aircrafts, which is a real concern considering how it's happened on several occasions. I'm sorry, almost happened on several occasions already, thankfully. But of course, BP doesn't have to worry about all that silly bureaucratic stuff because the U.S. government's far more concerned with just letting it have its drones. Surely it couldn't have anything to do with the fact that BP will be flying Puma and Scan Eagle drones, both of which are built by Boeing, which happens to be America's second largest defense contractor, or the fact that the company spent over $8 million lobbying Congress last year, according to Open Secrets. Either way, there are countless private companies salivating at the opportunity to get their hands on their very own drones, which by the looks of it is just over the horizon. But let's just hope Congress steps up to the plate, puts some rules in place before our skies are littered with BP's flying robots. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
In the U.S., illicit drug addiction is a rising epidemic. According to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in 2012, nearly 24 million Americans aged 12 or older had used or abused an illicit drug in the past month. And since 1980, the number of deaths in the U.S. attributed to drug overdoses has risen over 540%, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. Indeed, these statistics are shocking, but the medical field largely ignores what one physician says is the main driver behind them. According to Dr. Gabor Maté, the focus on genetics rather than environmental factors as the cause of addiction is leading the medical community astray. His latest book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, explores the roots of addiction and calls for a more compassionate approach toward the addict. Dr. Maté joined me earlier to discuss his groundbreaking work, and I began by asking him what led him to this controversial conclusion.
The general idea that addictions are genetic, which is the dominant idea still in medical practice, is really based on false interpretation of the data. And it's also based on ignoring the actual evidence. When you talk to people who are addicted, whether to sex or food or drugs or alcohol or shopping or whatever it is, and you ask them, what does this behavior do for you? They'll tell you that it gives me a sense of relief from pain. It's a momentary escape from distress. It gives me peace of mind temporarily. It helps to give me more contact with other people. It makes me more confident. In other words, the addict is just looking for some very normal human states.
There was just a study done by the Indiana University School of Medicine about genetic predisposition to alcoholism, and they claim that a group of 11 genes can successfully predict whether or not an individual is at an increased risk. I mean, this has been confirmed by some other studies. I mean, how do you interpret the findings of genes like that?
Well, I'll grant you that there may be increased risk, but what I'm saying is that the risk is not the same as a predetermination. So a predisposition is not the same as a predetermination. In other words, just because you have the gene, it doesn't mean you'll have the condition. It still depends on what happens to you. And we know from other studies that if human children have some of these genes, if they're brought up in nurturing homes, they will not be alcoholics or addicted. So it's still the environment that triggers the genes. We have this whole new science of epigenetics now that shows how genes are turned on and off by the environment. And that's the real question. And besides, this whole emphasis on genes is totally misplaced, because what can you do about genes? Nothing. So the real question is, what makes genes active or inactive? And that, to the answer to that question, we have to look to the environment. And the environment is something we can do about, something we can do something about. We can't do anything about the genes that people have. So the whole genetic argument is a cop-out from looking at reality.
And let's talk about the economic system in which we live as well. What is it about capitalism specifically that you say is making us sick?
Well, if you look at that question from the point of view of addiction, say alcoholism, there's always been, in the West, in the Western world, beginning in ancient Greece, there's always been drinking. In fact, there were spiritual practices based on alcohol, as we know. The Dionysian rites in ancient Greece and elsewhere were heavily dependent on alcohol. But that doesn't mean there was alcoholism. Alcoholism as a mass phenomenon did not arise until the rise of capitalism in England in the 18th century. And the cause of it wasn't the alcohol, because that was always available. The cause of it was the dislocation of people from their lands, the forced exit of people from the countryside into the cities, the separation of families, the breakdown of clan, tribe, community, village, family, and then the economic hardship that people underwent. These dislocations then gave rise to the massive need for escape and for distraction, and hence the alcoholism. So that there's a huge connection between the social system and the behavior of the individuals in that social system.
And what do you think is so wrong with the social system that we have right now in our current society that's causing this kind of exponential increase in addiction?
Well, I mean, whether you think it's wrong or not depends on your point of view. I can only point out that addictions are always an attempt to escape from stress. That's what they always are. In fact, the more stressed people are, the more addictively they're going to behave. And we all know this. If you've ever had an eating problem, when is it exactly that you're going to go home and stuff yourself with a full cookie? It's when you're stressed. And when do people relapse into addictive behaviors? It's when they're stressed. Now, the causes of stress are uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control over your life, and conflict. So the more you create these situations socially for people where there's uncertainty, loss of information, loss of control, insecurity, stress, the more addictive behaviors you're going to see. So it's rather predictable. So insofar as this system creates those conditions, which it increasingly does for a lot of people, you're going to see more addictions. Not to mention, of course, the specific case of people who are traumatized. I mean, again, the basic issue in severe addiction is always trauma. And you can look at what happens to soldiers, for example, who come back from Afghanistan or Iraq with post-traumatic stress disorder. They have a huge addiction rate, because the addiction is a way of them temporarily soothing their PTSD symptoms. So the more stressed and traumatized people are, the more likely they are to escape into self-soothing behaviors, which very often include substances. Sometimes will not be substances, sometimes will be gambling, or sex, or shopping.
Dr. Maté, according to the Centers for Disease Control, more than 10,000 American toddlers aged 2 to 3 years old are being medicated for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Why do you think there's been such an exponential rise in diagnosis of this specific disease in America, especially in such young children?
Yes. Now, ADHD, which is a subject of one of my books, the American title, which is Scattered, and I have been diagnosed with it myself, by the way, so I'm intimately familiar with it, is not a genetic disease like everybody says it is. If it was, we wouldn't be seeing this massive rise in it. Genes don't change in a population over 10 or 15 or 30 or even 100 years. What is really going on? The hallmark of ADHD, which is the tuning out, is not a disease. What it actually is a protection against stress. So when you're very stressed and you can't change the situation, escape from it, then what do? Your brain tunes out. So the question is, why are so many kids tuning out? They're tuning out because their parents are stressed, because the emotional states of the parents are translated into the biological activity of the child's brain. So when a lot of parents are stressed economically and otherwise, when children are growing up with less extended family, clan, neighborhood support, when the parents are more isolated, sometimes single parents under economic stress, that means that the kids are stressed, and the only way the kid's brain can deal with it is to tune out, and then we diagnose them with ADHD. So that ADHD is a genuinely increasing phenomenon, but the cause of it is massive social stress. And the solution is not to medicate these kids. It's just absurd that there are thousands of kids in the States under the age of 3 that are actually being medicated. It's a crime is what it is actually.
Dr. Maté, you work at the Portland hotel that treats addicts. You've also been a supporter of its project to open North America's first supervised injection site. I wanted you to talk about the benefits of such a program as well as things like needle exchanges.
Well, I'm retired from medical work now. I'm too busy traveling internationally, speaking and teaching and writing a new book. But I did work for 14 years for the Portland Hotel Society, which is a society dedicated to serving the hardcore drug-addicted population of Vancouver. And we did open North America's only supervised injection site, which is a place where people can bring their illegal drugs without fear of being arrested. They're given clean needles, sterile water, sterile swabs to clean their skins, and they inject under supervision. The idea being that if you don't use puddle water from the back alleys, but you use sterile water, if you don't use shared dirty needles but clean needles, you're less likely, you're unlikely, in fact, you're not going to pass on the infection to somebody else or get it from somebody else, like HIV or hepatitis C or many other diseases. And you're also less likely to, that'll give you a brain abscess or an abscess of your spine. So it's harm reduction. We're reducing the harm from addiction. And it's simply a life-saving measure and a measure that saves health dollars significantly, and a measure that makes human life much more livable for these very downtrodden and traumatized people.
That was Dr. Gabor Maté, author of In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And you guys stick around. I'll be talking about the 20th anniversary of one of the most disgustingly sensationalized criminal cases in recent history.
Are you like me? Do you want your comedy news with some teeth? Want your comedy news to be a bare-fisted, no-holds-barred fight to the death? Like a truth vampire biting into the necks of the corporate elite and the billionaire freaks while they're going, make it stop! Well, that's what you get with my new show, Redacted Tonight.
Is that too much? I think that's too much.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the Set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
If you're a frequent viewer of the show, you know that I often cover anniversaries of major events throughout American history. I mainly do this because the corporate media rarely touches controversial historical events in order to give us a better understanding of the present. But this week, I was extremely pleased to see the MSM all over one of the most important anniversaries of the 20th century.
This week marks 2 decades since the double murder which led to the trial and acquittal of O.J. Simpson. Simpson's now in prison for another crime, but for many, his fall from grace began 20 years ago this Thursday.
A body in a river of blood. Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson.
2 bodies butchered. One of them, O.J.'s ex-wife. slashed, stabbed, everything else. Nicole was nearly decapitated.
If you watch the O.J. Simpson case unfold, and I did as a TV reporter for KCBS in L.A., it's a moment in time you could never forget.
Yes, we will never forget the white Ford Bronco, ill-fitting glove, and unrelenting O.J. media circus, thanks to you. See, over the course of this week, the MSM is running no less than 3 several-hour-long specials on the 20th anniversary of the O.J. Simpson case. CNN's feature ran last night called O.J.'s Wild Ride, 20 years after the chase. NBC's Dateline debuts its 2-hour special tomorrow called The People versus O.J. Simpson, What the Jury Never Heard. And not to be outdone, Fox News' Greta Van Susteren is hosting her very own special, recapping her claim to fame as one of the primary reporters who dissected every outrageous Johnny Cochran outburst during the trial of the century. Yes, because just in case you didn't get enough force-fed tabloid celebrity murder fodder the first time around, here's your chance to relive the good old days when our biggest problem was a psychotic football player that got away with murder. So while the corporate media continues to re-traumatize Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman's families, what incredibly important story is being missed? Well, in a huge victory for polluters, the Supreme Court voted 7-2 in favor of a company called CTS. It's allegedly responsible for the mass release of toxic chemicals in the city of Asheville, North Carolina. See, CTS shut down its electronics plant in Asheville back in 1987. But according to North Carolina state statute, a company is no longer liable for its actions 10 years after its initial contamination. The problem is that the toxic release of CTS's chemicals weren't discovered until 1999, 2 years after that 10-year window expired. Today, several Asheville residents living near the site suffer from everything from thyroid disorders to brain tumors. And just this year, 13 people living near the contaminated area were urged to evacuate by the EPA after it found unsafe levels of the carcinogenic chemical TCE in the air. Perhaps most disturbingly is that the Department of Justice actually filed an amicus brief in support of CTS's argument. Now, considering that federal law states that the statute of limitations for the company's liability starts when the contamination is discovered, the DOJ's support for CTS makes 0 sense. So why would the Obama administration argue on behalf of this criminally negligent company? Well, because from the 1950s all the way up until the mid-1980s, chemicals were released from a dry cleaning facility into the drinking water at the U.S. Marine Corps base, Camp Lejeune. And Camp Lejeune just happens to be located in North Carolina. As a result, many Marines and other personnel at the base developed cancer and other serious sicknesses, leading Obama to sign a bill in 2012 that provided medical care for those affected. Except that bill provided absolutely no monetary compensation for the victims, which is why the DOJ specifically cited in the amicus brief the fact that there was, quote, ongoing litigation against the U.S. concerning the issue. Translation: 750,000 potential victims at Camp Lejeune will never be compensated by the government. And that's the real reason why the DOJ supported the toxic company CTS, to cover their own behinds. So essentially what the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice just ensured is that if you're a company that releases cancer-causing chemicals into the environment and cover up your actions for 10 years, then you're in the clear. But hey, at least we can sleep at night knowing that there's no statute of limitations for covering a 20-year-old celebrity murder case. Last week, an Oregon man filed a federal lawsuit against the government for a 2012 police brutality incident that left him in the need of back surgery. According to the plaintiff, Jermaine Robinson, he was biking near his home when 2 cops pulled him over for bike violations and then proceeded to throw him off the bike, beat and taser him. Now, Robinson, who's an African-American, is also requesting that the city police department institutes a new policy against racial profiling. And rightfully so, because racial profiling when it comes to policing is hardly confined to Oregon. According to the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, 25% of police officers have witnessed fellow officers harassing a citizen, most likely because of their race. 52% agree that it's not unusual for a police officer to turn a blind eye to improper conduct by other officers. And 49% feel that the only way a criminal would receive punishment was to punish the individual himself. So here to discuss the institutional reasons behind these statistics, as well as his new film on police brutality called Black and Blue, I'm joined now by filmmaker Dylan Avery. Thank you so much for coming on, Dylan.
Hey, Abby,
good to see you, man. So before we get into your latest work, you made the film Loose Change. It's probably the most viral online documentary ever made. I mean, how did that insane experience change you as a person and a filmmaker?
Drastically and unexpectedly. You know, it's funny that I'm here in DC 10 years after I was living here finalizing Loose Change, and I really had no way of anticipating how big it was going to be, how drastically it was going to change my life, how many people would reach out to me, and just how much was going to happen. So insanely, it would insanely change my life.
You know, really briefly, what do you think about kind of the movement being hijacked by kind of this everything's a conspiracy and everything's a false flag now?
You know, that's one of the reasons I had to walk away. In about 2006 is when it started. You know, you had the whole no planes at the World Trade Center nonsense and all that. So really, it really kind of came to a head 2006, 2007, and it was over the following couple of years where I realized you know, you say that you're for 9/11 truth, and you could mean that you're for a new investigation into the attacks, but then they'll think, you know, whoever you're talking to, like, oh, you think that no planes at the World Trade Center.
So Sandy Hook didn't happen, right?
Yeah,
like,
so Sandy Hook didn't happen, and I mean, like, everything's a false flag, you know, everything is a government cover-up. I mean, 24 hours in, before we even have any information, it's automatically being declared as one thing or another. So it's a dangerous situation we find ourselves in.
It is, Dylan. I think we're on the same page in a lot of ways. And I think what people were most upset about, including me, is that this political, amazing filmmaker, took such a long break from making political commentary. But you're back, baby. You're back. You're making a film about police brutality. What initially made you want to tackle this huge subject?
Well, you know, I'd been somewhat following the issue for a long time. You know, when Oscar Grant happened, I was up at a lot of the protests up in Oakland, but it didn't really start to seem like something that I should pursue or tackle until I moved to Los Angeles. You know, coming from upstate New York, my experiences with the police had generally been pretty positive, and even traveling across the country, you know, there were a couple times where I possibly could have been in trouble and I wasn't. So it was quite a shock to me to move to Los Angeles, and, you know, one night I'm walking my dog past midnight, and before I know it, I'm being interrogated by a Los Angeles deputy sheriff because I don't have my ID, and I'm like, dude, my house is right there. Like, I can literally walk and get my ID. He's like, no, get into the back of my car, and we're gonna get to the bottom of this. So that was a real eye-opener for me, and if it wasn't for the fact that I had my dog with me, I probably would have gotten a little bit more mouthy with him, but I've seen what cops do to dogs.
Right.
And I'm sitting in the back of my cop car, and I'm seeing this cop, like, walk up to my dog, and I'm just like, oh, please just don't let anything... And that was a real eye-opener to me, because it went from, we no longer see a cop car and feel protected. We feel intimidated. We feel scared. We wonder, you know, am I going to be the next Oscar Grant? Am I going to be the next whoever? You know, choose your example. And that's the thing, is there are so many examples now of injustice and police brutality, and it's not just beatings, you know, it's not just shootings, it's botched investigations, it's money doing all the talking when someone's innocent son is killed by his best friend, things like that. Like, it's across the board. The whole justice system right now is backwards.
So you're seeing a lot of these systemic, kind of institutionalized things as your investigation's unfolding. You've been talking to victims' families across the country. Dylan, another aspect of police brutality is the war machine stockpiling local and state police forces. I mean, according to the Pentagon's own data, since 2006, precincts across the U.S. have been given 432 MRAP machines. I mean, these things are like giant tanks, 533 aircrafts, over 94,000 machine guns, 435 other armored vehicles, whatever that means. I mean, how much do you think the militarization of police has to do with the increased levels of force that we're seeing?
Very much so. They're intrinsically tied. I mean, Fargo, North Dakota has a tank now. And I mean, when I think terrorist attacks, I don't think Fargo, North Dakota. You know, you've got these guys, they're overseas, they're in Afghanistan, they're Iraq, they're in legitimate war zones, and then they come back to America, and then they become police officers. So they spend all day, every day, being shot at, being threatened, fearing for their life, etc. And then they come home, and then they're given a badge and a gun, and they're told to go out into the streets, and they bring that mentality back home with them. So I think that the militarization of the police is a big facet of why we find ourselves faced with the problem that we have now.
Yeah. You know, a few months ago, I spoke to Ray Lewis. He was a police commissioner for Philadelphia, and he became an Occupy activist, actually. And he said that police agencies actually vet candidates who are the most sociopathic and lacking empathy. I mean, it's just amazing to hear this coming from someone as high up as he was. I mean, do you think that there's a systematic effort here from the top down to institutionalize this kind of brutality?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was that headline that was going around a while ago where, someone tried to become a cop and they told them, oh, I'm sorry, your IQ is too high. And that's the thing is, like, what kind of person wants to both follow orders and then enforce the orders that they're given onto other people? Like, it takes a certain, like, I don't see you or me becoming a police officer. I don't see any of these cops getting off the job and going home and playing their guitar. Which isn't to say that all cops are bad, which is really the kind of paradigm that I'm trying to make sure I make clear from the start with this is not an anti-police film, it is an anti-police brutality and injustice film. So if you were a good cop, you got nothing to worry about. But if you're a bad cop, then you might wind up in my film.
Why do you think this is, Dylan? Because I feel like compared to other, especially European countries, I guess, America just has such, what's become an epidemic now of this brutality. What is it about this country?
I don't know. I think that the past decade, a lot of things in this country have changed. I mean, before September 11th, there was no TSA. There was no Department of Homeland Security. Border Patrol was handled by Border Patrol. Now it's handled by the Department of Homeland Security. You have seen an increase of a war machine that was already there and already existed. I mean, Smedley Butler was, very clear on that. Dwight Eisenhower, warned us about the military-industrial complex, except now that has seeped into our local police departments. So it's really hard to try and point to one particular thing and say this is the cause, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do it in the film, but we have a serious situation on our hands, and I think that there's a lot of facets that play into it.
Yeah, you're right. I think it really is the military mind, children of the empire, having kind of this moral authority to, we're policing the world. Why not over-police our communities as well? I just read the statistic. You're a whopping 8 times more likely to be killed by a cop than a terrorist, Dylan. I mean, considering this insane statistic, why don't you think Congress and people are kind of actively trying to combat this problem?
I think that's exactly why. And when I filed a complaint with the lieutenant after that happened with the deputy sheriff, what do you think the lieutenant said to me? Well, because of September 11th, we have to be a lot more vigilant. And yet, since 3,000 innocent people died on September 11th, and since 9/11, more American citizens have been killed by police officers than died on September 11th. That is a big problem. These guys are supposed to protect and to serve, not to coerce, intimidate, and act as judge, jury, and executioner.
And Dylan, we have about 30 seconds left. Where can people go out to find more about your project and support your work?
Right now, I have a website registered. There has no website right now, so if you go to Facebook, Black and Blue Movie, look it up. I'm looking for stories, I'm looking for music, I'm looking for lots of things. So this is a very early stage in the process, and it's nice to get on and talk about it before things get really crazy.
Well, thank you so much for doing it, putting attention to such a serious issue, Dylan. I cannot wait to see the film. Thanks so much for coming on, man. Really appreciate it. It's a rising epidemic. According to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in 2012, nearly 24 million Americans aged 12 or older had used or abused an illicit drug in the past month. And since 1980, the number of deaths in the U.S. attributed to drug overdoses has risen over 540%, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. Indeed, these statistics are shocking, but the medical field largely ignores what one physician says is the main driver behind them. According to Dr. Gabor Maté, the focus on genetics rather than environmental factors as the cause of addiction is leading the medical community astray. His latest book in the realm of hungry ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction.
Once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
In the U.S., illicit drug addiction. Happy Wednesday, world. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Heads up, everyone. The FAA has just announced the very first commercial drone license for unmanned flights over American soil. So what lucky corporation was granted such an unprecedented license? Well, none other than my favorite oil giant and earth polluter, BP. Yes, BP's unmanned flights will be taking place over Alaska's Prudhoe Bay, some of the most pristine wilderness on the planet. You know, just the type of place that BP loves to cover and leak petroleum. Hell, BP had its third oil spill in the Alaskan tundra, Scan Eagle drones, both of which are built by Boeing, which happens to be America's second largest defense contractor. Or the fact that the company spent over $8 million lobbying Congress last year, according to Open Secrets. Either way, there are countless private companies salivating at the opportunity to get their hands on their very own drones, which by the looks of it is just over the horizon. But let's just hope Congress steps up to the plate, puts some rules in place before our skies are littered with BP's flying robots. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make it up.
Just last month. And now it's flying drones over the area to monitor the pipeline. See, Congress and the FAA didn't even plan to issue commercial drone licenses to private entities until September of 2015 in order to ensure safety rules of the industry. But I guess that just wasn't soon enough for BP. And now Congress will be forced to rush regulations to prevent mid-air collisions with regular aircrafts, which is a real concern considering how it's happened on several occasions. I'm sorry, almost happened on several occasions already, thankfully. But of course, BP doesn't have to worry about all that silly bureaucratic stuff because the U.S. government's far more concerned with just letting it have its drones. Surely it couldn't have anything to do with the fact that BP will be flying Puma and